Hello and welcome back to Invisible Hate. I'm Asad the Butt.
And I'm Saadia Khan.
It's October 1989 in Boston. Charles, Stuart, and his pregnant wife Carol are leaving a birthing class at Brigham and Women's Hospital. They are both shot, Charles in the abdomen and Carol in the head. Charles calls 911 from their car phone. He tells emergency responders that a black man forced his way into the car and that person demanded that they drive to the Mission Hill neighborhood in Boston. When EMTs get there, Charles said the man had robbed them and, thinking they're cops, shot them both. He keeps telling EMTs to take care of his wife. Both are critically injured and rushed to different hospitals. Charles goes into a 6-hour surgery on his liver and other internal organs, but his prognosis is good. Carol, meanwhile, is rushed back to the same hospital they were just at for their birthing class, but dies within a few hours. Their baby, named Christopher, is delivered via emergency C-section and is baptized immediately, but he dies 17 days later due to oxygen deprivation and trauma sustained in the shooting. Charles recovers and is released from the hospital 6 weeks later. Meanwhile, the city of Boston is engaged in a manhunt to find the perpetrator. This is Invisible Hate. Welcome back to Invisible Hate, a weekly true crime podcast in which Saadia and I attempt to uncover the ugly truth behind various hate crimes, both recent and historical.
Our regular listeners know that many of these cases we discuss involve crimes committed against minority groups. Our goal is to determine through a discussion of the nuances and complexities of these unfortunate situations whether or not these transgressions can be considered hate crimes. So I said, before we dive in, what's going on in your life?
So Saadia, Yisha is now 13 months old, and Erica and I had a nice night out to a comedy show recently. We saw comedian Hassan Minhaj
Nice.
in his new show, which was great. I think that he's such a funny comedian, and I love supporting, Muslim and Desi artists. And I don't know how much you know about him and his comedy, but, he was set to host The Daily Show as the new host, and then the New Yorker ran what I think is a hit job on him, basically like calling him out for embellishing his comedy, and then he ends up not getting the job as the host of The Daily Show. And one of the jokes that he had, I'm not giving away too much, but he basically talking about being the son of Indian immigrants, basically how he failed so hard that The Daily Show brought Jon Stewart back to that. I thought that was a pretty funny line.
I love it, Asad. You know what? With minorities, we know that there are different set of standards for us. We have to be absolutely perfect to qualify for anything. It's sad, it's disappointing, but it's the truth. And that's why, unfortunately, we are held to unattainable standards in a way.
Totally. Yeah. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Asad. I'm busy with creating more content. We have 3 live podcasts. We are launching 2 more in June, one about sports, and the other one about elections.
Amazing.
Very excited about that. But yeah, life goes on. My kids, both my girls, are in college. I'm really waiting for them to come back for summer. Kids bring us so much joy, as you have, Isha. You know what that experience, that feeling is like.
Totally.
Should we get started?
Yeah, so Saadia, it's 1989, and I was 10 years old at the time when this happened. And I remember even now, this kind of just taking over the coverage in Boston and even beyond. But I grew up in Boston. So remember, this is pre-cell phone. So obviously there was, as we discussed in the opening, the car phone. This is kind of pre-internet and all the many other things we've come to love about modern life. And so I just want to make sure that our listeners remember that as we're talking through this case.
Especially young ones, Asad.
Yeah. Who don't know any before TikTok.
Exactly, before TikTok.
Totally. So Charles and Carol Stuart are a young, middle-class white couple living in a suburb of Boston. Charles is 29 and Carol is 30. They each grew up in the Boston area and they met while working at a restaurant 10 years before. They've been married for about 4 years. Carol is a tax attorney and Charles manages a fur store on Newbury Street in Boston, which is a place for high-end stores in the city. They are well liked by all and perceived to be the perfect couple. In October of that year, Carol is 7 months pregnant. Their baby is due the day after Christmas. They are on their way home from their birthing class when Charles calls 911 to report that they've been shot. Police and EMT race to the scene. Saadia, I know that you didn't grow up here, but are you aware of these shows that were really popular around this time, like Cops? You know, they follow real police and stuff.
I probably don't, Asad. But here's the thing. There were a lot of Hollywood shows that I used to watch in Pakistan. I would say this, though. When we came to the US in early 2000s, we came to Cambridge. So Boston is where we landed. And I fell in love with the city in early 2000s at least. But I didn't know how racist the city is by some standards. And you grew up there. So I'm curious to know what your experience was.
Yeah, I think that Boston just has a history of basically segregated communities and racism. I think growing up, I guess I experienced more of the Islamophobia more than, I guess that is a form of racism. But even still, I think like the way that the African American community was treated in the greater Boston area or New England is completely different than other minorities were treated. But yeah, that all plays a factor into this case, as we will discuss. But going back, Saadia, so shows like Cops are really popular around the time. They basically follow real police. They have cameras, and as they go out to do whatever arrests or investigations, like they're filming, and then they turn it into a TV show. One of those shows at that time was called Rescue 911, and as fate would have it, a crew from Rescue 911 was filming the emergency person who was going to the scene where Charles and Carol Stuart were shot.
Interesting.
I got out of the ambulance, grabbed some equipment, made my way over to the driver's side of the car, which was closest to me. My partner Dan went around to the other side to attend to the woman.
They happened to be filming in Boston that evening and are riding with emergency responders, meaning that the entire chaos is captured on film, which is like pretty rare for us to get a glimpse from that perspective, right? And at first, when he calls on his car phone to 911, the EMT can't seem to find where Charles and Carol are. I guess that Charles is having trouble describing his location, and he says the gunman made them drive to an abandoned lot, and he's not near any landmarks that he knows about, and that he's feeling woozy from being shot. So, dispatchers, we talked about this in the last episode, but, these dispatchers are pretty remarkable people. And so what they do, Saadia, and I've heard them doing this before, is that they start hearing the sirens in the background of Charles's phone. And so they know that they're nearby, and so what they do is they tell one police officer or whatever EMT to like play their siren, and they ask the other to play their siren, and then they're able to be like, okay, this one's closer, and they're able to direct people to to the exact location.
Oh wow, that's remarkable.
These people are just awesome. And yeah, anyway, so finally EMT get to the scene and rush to get the two of them aid. Remember, Charles was shot in the abdomen, and Carol, who is 7 months pregnant, was shot in the head. They discover that Carol is slumped over in the front seat and unresponsive. Charles is also bleeding and is in pain, but able to tell them what happened. He says a black man jumped into the car at a red light, made them drive to this abandoned location, robbed them, and then shot them both before running off. He says he doesn't know who the man was, but he says the perpetrator had a raspy voice and was wearing a tracksuit with a red stripe. Charles, while in pain, is actually really coherent and really convincing. Here's a clip from the Rescue 911 show of him being loaded into the ambulance.
Right up. Take care of my wife.
Yeah, please tell me that people taking care of her.
Who did this? Out of the way. Black man. One guy, two guys, one.
Asad, what's surprising to me is that according to Charles, this person, robs them and then shoots both of them and leaves. Why would he shoot his wife in the head and not do the same to Charles?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's a question that some people ask, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So yeah, anyways, the two of them are rushed to different hospitals. Meanwhile, police start to investigate, and what happens next will shock you all.
So we are going to take a quick break before we discuss what happened next. I can't wait. Welcome back to Invisible Hate. So Asad, we're back. Charles and his wife are rushed to the hospital, and Charles says, and I quote, "A black man was responsible." What happens next, Asad?
So the city of Boston essentially goes hysterical after Carol's death. Part of this was the crime. Remember, 2 white people shot in a predominantly black neighborhood. And part of it was that it was caught on TV, right? They have footage of it.
Asad, but just thinking about the optics, right? A young 30-year-old pregnant woman shot in the head. Anybody would have such a visceral reaction towards it, right?
And a photo of the couple bleeding in the car is actually on the front page of the Boston Herald, one of the 2 major newspapers in Boston at the time. And just remember, this is a time, again, we talked about pre-internet, pre-cell phones, all that kind of stuff, that the way that you got your news was through the newspapers, through the radio, or through the evening news, right? Or morning news or whatever. And so, yeah, people in Boston really start to connect to the couple. As we mentioned, they are attractive, they're well-liked, Carol is pregnant, so lots of people in Boston are just heartbroken and terrified.
And let's not forget, Asad, she's white.
Yeah, right. And we've talked about this before on this podcast, the kind of, I forgot what it's called, white girl
syndrome,
right, where coverage of white victims ends up getting exorbitantly more coverage than other victims. And sadly, a lot of people are asking, how could this happen? The mayor of Boston at the time is a guy named Ray Flynn. Flynn has a good reputation with everyone, but particularly amongst black voters. Flynn goes and visits the hospital and promises to put all available detectives on the case. Remember, there's a huge outcry from the public and media attention. And so, this becomes a huge deal, a big deal. So many people feel for Charles, having lost his wife, and with his son, remember at this time, was struggling to survive in the hospital. And in fact, first responders and law enforcement officers actually praised Charles, saying, and I quote, "The individual hero in this case was Mr. Stuart."
The gut and the grizzle and the savvy this man had, just the will to live, to keep on going, is incredible.
Yeah, so apparently it does seem like he was very brave in the way he conducted himself, right? But I'm sure there's more to it, Asad.
Of course, there always is, right?
So what happens? You said the police are putting a lot of resources into this, right?
Yeah, so basically a massive manhunt ensues, specifically targeting black men in the Mission Hill neighborhood where the shooting took place. At the time, Mission Hill is a primarily black and Latino working class neighborhood. It has a lot of crime, but most of it seems to be just robberies for small amounts of cash, often to buy drugs. The police department in Boston launches a systemic campaign of going door to door in the public housing projects, and they do a lot of what's called stop and frisks in the streets, where basically like you're just walking along and they say, I'm going to check you, and without any justification for searching you.
That's so messed up, Asad.
Yeah, totally. Around 150 black men and boys are searched in the 5 days after the murder alone, without cause and often involving public strip searches. Just wild violations of people's rights. Mayor Flynn also brings in 100 additional officers to the predominantly black neighborhoods. And then, Saadia, once the baby Christopher dies, the case becomes a double homicide.
Asad, an important fact for our listeners, apparently 38 states consider the murder of a pregnant woman to be a double homicide. Some take into account whether a fetus is born alive. I mean, I believe as Christopher was through the C-section, they would consider him a live birth, right?
Yeah, so I totally see why this would be charged as a double homicide. So, Saadia, just some things to note, and we talked about it earlier about the, racist past of Boston. It really has a wildly racist past, and in 1989, some things improved a little, but not a lot. There is a huge divide between the black and white communities, and just lots of systemic racism, as you can imagine. This case makes things worse. The investigation increases tensions between law enforcement and residents of color. It worsens the mistrust that minorities have in police, and it increases the fear that white people have of black neighborhoods in the city. Reports of hate crimes against black residents actually skyrocket, and black residents start to lose faith in the mayor.
Okay, so I thought I would not say this, but I just cannot stop myself because it really annoys me. I see a lot of times in the US, white people are afraid of all the minorities, right? It's like they're scared, they feel threatened, while we go about living our lives. And I'm sure it is particularly problematic in case of African Americans in the US, but it's also true for other minorities. And we see that play out every now and then.
It's the fear of the other, and you've just been propagandized by the media or by whatever content that you look at and read or watch or whatever to think that, certain people are a certain way. And it's sad.
But I said, you and I are pretty harmless, though.
I certainly am. I don't know about you. When you get behind the wheel, I feel like maybe your driving habits are potentially destructive.
Listeners, just ignore us.
So anyway, meanwhile, Saadia, as police continue their hunt to find this kind of quote-unquote mysterious black man that Charles said shot him and his wife, others are starting to realize something is a little fishy with Charles himself. So first of all, there's kind of no evidence that this perpetrator even existed as described by Charles Stuart. And then there's also just holes in Charles's story itself. The first thing that people note is something that you brought up earlier, which is why was the wife shot in the head and he shot in the stomach? You would think that, like, as the man in the car, he is the one that potentially could, like, wrestle with the perpetrator to get the gun away and all that kind of stuff. You'd think that he would be the one that would have the worse gunshot, right?
Yeah, and why would he leave a witness behind?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Second, when Charles calls 911 operators, he never mentioned that his wife is pregnant or asks them to hurry up and help. Third, the shooting takes place in an odd location. We've mentioned this multiple times, with no obvious escape route for the perpetrator. So then, like, how do they end up there and why? And then similarly, there are no witnesses that report seeing this, quote, mysterious man in a striped tracksuit that night. So just like a lot of inconsistencies. And then finally, some people, including the police, thought Charles seemed too collected and too coherent that night, as if he was like, had practiced it, right? In fact, Saadia, the initial detectives on the case actually suspected Charles immediately because he seemed too composed when recounting the attack.
So I said, did they explore any alternate scenarios? Did they look at other people, including Charles? Like, was there any investigation into these possible iterations of what may have happened?
I think based on everything that we've seen, that the police and the DA's office was really just like blinded and believed what Charles said as gospel. Those two initial detectives that we just talked about that interviewed him, actually, they go to the hospital every day to try to re-interview him, but they are ignored by their supervisors, and shortly afterwards, they're removed from the case altogether.
What?
Yeah, some other authorities do wonder whether Charles's injuries could be self-inflicted, but most doctors think it unlikely given the severity of the shooting. So there's like just a lot of questions, right? And remember, this is all happening while there is huge press coverage and a manhunt going on in the city.
I said, what's interesting to me is in the world of true crime, we all know that husband/partner is almost always the murderer, right?
Yeah, I think that maybe that's something that has come to fruition over these past, whatever, couple decades of this true crime,
Enough data to suggest that.
Yeah, they did. Exactly. Anyway, the president of the NAACP tells Mayor Flynn that something is amiss, but is told that he doesn't know what he's talking about. Given how beloved the victims are, the press is actually really cautious about portraying Charles negatively or casting any doubt on his story. Charles, meanwhile, has never broken the law and mostly elicits sympathy. And I think for a lot of people, you just can't imagine that a husband would shoot his pregnant wife, right? Like, I think that's like
You're right.
hard to like fathom.
I mean, you could shoot your wife, but not your pregnant wife, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, there is just something like inherently like how could someone do that, right? But we've seen it time and time again, obviously. So anyway, here's what happens. Just 4 days after the murder, police arrest a transient black man named Alan Swanson. An officer finds newspaper clippings about the case behind Swanson's toilet and a black tracksuit soaking in the sink. And just a note here, black tracksuits at the time are just everywhere. So like that's not random. And like the fact that he has clippings of a major story, I don't know, that doesn't seem like it's real evidence to me. But they don't arrest him on the murder of Carol. They actually arrest him on the charge of an unarmed burglary. He claims that he was too intoxicated the evening that the crime took place to commit it, and he's terrified of going to jail and really fears that he might be murdered in prison for being charged with murdering this pregnant woman. After 3 weeks, though, he's ruled out and released, but obviously he's still very traumatized. Meanwhile, hundreds of mourners, including prominent figures, attend Carol's funeral. Charles doesn't attend. He's still in the hospital recovering, but he writes a really touching goodbye to Carol that is read aloud at the service.
Good night, sweet wife, my love. God has called you to his hands, not to take you away from me, all the happiness and gladness you brought, but to bring you away from the cruelty and violence that fills this world. In our souls,
and as you can imagine, every little detail was covered in the press, right? This was just like, this is one of those cases that everybody wanted to know the latest and greatest, and it was the front page story day in, day out.
I said Charles is portraying himself to be this perfect husband, calm and collected when it happened, writing this touching goodbye note for his wife, getting all the sympathies and attention, and obviously severely injured, right? So people would think, who would inflict such an injury on themselves and, as you said, would kill their own child? I can see why people were sympathizing with him.
Especially if you're getting all your information from the press and the press isn't providing the details and the police are not investigating every single lead. Totally. And, Saadia, as the investigation continues, rumors materialize from a bunch of teens that a man named Willie Bennett is maybe responsible. In fact, Willie Bennett's nephew is one of those teens that is engaged in these rumors. And so Bennett is a black man from Mission Hill with a long criminal record of mostly robberies and shootings, including a non-fatal shooting of a police officer. So in probably the police mind, like, he fits the bill. And he has a raspy voice and, like many men in the 80s, owns a tracksuit. He is a dropout and has a reputation for being either a badass or a troublemaker, depending on who you ask. And so for whatever reason, these teens are spreading this rumor that Bennett may be responsible. And, Saadia, as police are chasing down every lead, they actually end up showing up at one of these teens' schools and then also at one of these teens' friends' house, where they end up detaining the teen.
Wow. So they show up at school? I mean, how old was this boy, Asad?
Yeah, he was 17, Saadia, and the police were going to do everything to try to track things down, including do things basically illegally. When he talks to police, the boy says that they were just messing around when it comes to Bennett and the shootings, and they don't know what happened, kind of making stuff up. But the cops put him in the car and take him in for questioning. They interview him for hours without representation, and they make threats against him. And as you can imagine, they coach him to implicate Bennett.
Oh, no.
After getting the teen to say Bennett admitted he is responsible, police bust into his grandmother's house in the middle of the night looking for him, and they end up destroying parts of the house. He's not there, but they steal a photograph that's not even of Bennett and publish it in the paper, saying that Bennett is the primary suspect.
Oh, wow.
He is then arrested at his girlfriend's house, but not charged with the shooting. Instead, he is held on unrelated charges for a video store robbery. Police try to build their case against Bennett to present to a grand jury. Meanwhile, Bennett says he's innocent, and he says that he didn't do it, and that the police knows that he didn't do it, and that it's just because of his reputation. That's why he's being looked at. In late December, a few weeks after Charles is released from the hospital, he picks Bennett out of a lineup as the person that shot him and his wife. It's highly likely, though, Saadia, that he had seen Bennett's face in the papers beforehand.
That's what I was going to say, Asad. This is so messed up. Now, I agree. There is probably a lot of pressure on the police, right? Media is probably publishing all these stories every day. Public pressure is immense, and they are just trying to find a person that they can present as the perpetrator, right? So they've already assumed that the perpetrator is African American, that the perpetrator probably is from a particular neighborhood in Boston, and they're just trying to find a person that really fits the bill. That's how I see it.
100%. And yeah, I think both the police, the DA, the press, everybody's under immense pressure to find who did this and prove who did this. And so
I think it's more about proving, Asad, than finding. I don't think they are even investigating other alternate theories. They are just fixated on this one theory.
For sure. Okay, so now we are a few months after the shooting, right, Saadia? And a week after Charles picks Bennett out of the lineup, Charles's youngest brother, Matthew, goes to the police. Matthew tells them that Charles had arranged for him to come to Mission Hill on the night of the murder and to dispose of a bag that he had.
What?
Yeah, the bag contained a small silver revolver, Carol's purse and ID, rings, and a wristwatch.
Oh my gosh, Asad, that's so messed up and so evil.
So Matthew ends up throwing everything into the Pines River in Revere, which is a suburb of Boston. He actually throws everything except for the engagement ring, which he gives to police as proof to his story. He tells them it was some kind of, quote, insurance fraud scheme, and that Charles had originally asked Matthew to steal Carol's jewelry from his home in a staged robbery, but then changed his mind.
Oh, wow. So he changed his mind from a robbery to murder?
Murder, yeah. Matthew claims that his brother Charles paid him $10,000 to dispose of the bag that night. Matthew denies knowing anything about the murder plot and said he couldn't make out what happened in the car at the time. That same day that Matthew speaks to police, Charles meets with his lawyer. He's gotten wind that Matthew is talking to the police and that they'll be looking for him soon. So he checks into a hotel in Braintree, which is just south of Boston. And very early the following morning, Charles drives to a major bridge called the Tobin Bridge in the Boston area in his brand new car. He stops on the lower level, pops the hood, turns on the hazard lights, and then he jumps into the water below, killing himself.
Oh my gosh.
Really crazy stuff. He leaves a note in his car to family and friends, thanking them for their support and saying the new accusation against him is just too much to handle. He does not take any responsibility for the crime. We'll take another quick break before we talk about what follows next. This is Invisible Hate.
Welcome back to Invisible Hate. So Charles has just committed suicide after his brother implicates him in the murder. Asad, what happens next?
Yeah, so Charles's lifeless body is recovered not long after he jumps. Divers later on find the stuff in the river the following week. Police also then extract the bullet that was in Charles's abdomen, and they want to see if it matches the gun. Meanwhile, Bennett, who was being held in connection with this and who was actually never charged for the murder, nor was Swanson, is exonerated. What is crazy is that there doesn't seem to be any accountability by the press or the police or the DA's office into what happened. However, even after Charles's suicide, in a legal brief opposing the release of the lineup video, the DA says, and I quote, "The man reportedly identified in the lineup may yet to turn out to have some connection with the case." So even after Charles' suicide and him being named the prime suspect, they still think that Bennett is somehow connected to what happened.
But they don't have any evidence to prove that.
No evidence. Yep. Some members of the press and police still badmouth Bennett, saying he's an idiot, a sociopath, and degenerate, and that they are not to blame for suspecting him. All the same, the suicide does lead to a backlash against the police, against the DA, and the media. People seem to come out of the woodwork presenting evidence implicating Charles. So first, Matthew had told a few of his siblings and his best friend about what had happened. Second, the owner of the first store where Charles worked noticed that the gun from the store's safe, a small silver revolver, had gone missing. Third, the surgeon that operated on Charles the night of the murder found him uncharacteristically calm and reserved. And then meanwhile, acquaintances say Charles was a psychopath and that he exaggerated many details about his education and athletic prowess. And then 2 weeks before the murder took place, he took out a $500,000 insurance policy on his wife, which police apparently did not look into.
Yeah, because they were fixated on his story, right? They believed him.
100%. And records show that Charles actually cashed in on Carol's insurance policy for her jewelry from her employer and was waiting on a $100,000 policy from the insurance company. He, I guess, wanted to open up a restaurant with the money. Supposedly, Saadia, he may have had a mistress as well.
Oh my gosh.
So just like a lot of things coming out of the woodworks. He had also, get this, Saadia recently talked with a coworker about how many shootings had taken place in black neighborhoods in the city.
All of this seems so preemptive, Asad, right? He's just, prepping for this crime.
Exactly. The ego on this guy, it's just unbelievable. All in all, at least 30 people knew that Charles was the culprit before Matthew approached the police.
You must be kidding me, Asad. I really 30 people already knew.
30 people, that's a lot of people.
And they were okay with what was happening?
I think some people had approached the police and the police disregarded it, right? I think that there's some of that, and there's some that people knew it and didn't do anything. And I guess, officers did, ignore some tips. Here's a clip.
They had this description from Chuck Stuart, and they just took it and ran with it. And in fact, one of the interesting things we found was that the original detectives on the case were very skeptical of his story, and they thought he should be a prime suspect. And instead of pursuing that, they pulled him off the case in favor of having it investigated by people who had already bought into this narrative.
So anyway, after all this comes out, a grand jury is formed to investigate. They want to figure out who knew what when. Given the angle that Carol was shot, some thought that maybe the brother was there and pulled the trigger. A friend of Charles who had spoken with police after Carol's murder testifies that Charles had mentioned wanting Carol killed. I guess that Charles told him that he wanted Carol to have an abortion, and that friend said that Charles felt she had the upper hand in the marriage after she got pregnant and was worried she'd become a stay-at-home mom.
So he wanted her to continue working, basically.
He wanted her to continue working. He wanted to have the upper hand in the marriage. He didn't want the child, right? I think that's what this friend was saying.
Yeah, he was a psychopath.
Exactly. There's very clear premeditation and seems to be no doubt that Charles is the murderer. On November 19th, 1990, the grand jury concludes their investigation. They indict Matthew, the brother, as well as his best friend, John McMahon, for disposing the gun and the purse. 2 years later, both of them plead guilty, concluding the prosecution. Matthew ends up spending 3 years in prison for obstruction of justice and insurance fraud. Also in 1990, the Attorney General's Civil Rights Division issues a report on Boston Police Department practices. They address two major allegations. One, how police conducted those stop and frisks, and that the police used coercive interrogation techniques to falsely implicate Willie Bennett. They interview 50 plus people who say officers conducted a stop and frisk without basis, reached into their underwear or pockets,
oh my gosh,
or submitted them to public strip searches.
So humiliating.
They also review footage and documents and meet with the witnesses. They conclude, and I quote here, that Boston police officers engaged in improper and unconstitutional conduct in that period with respect to stops and searches of minority individuals in the communities surrounding Boston. And they said that the police appeared to have threatened, coerced, and offered favors to obtain testimony that would implicate Willie Bennett. But Saadia, as you can imagine, these acts went unpunished.
That's so sad, Asad.
Yep, the Boston Police Department was unwilling or unable to provide a counter-narrative to these findings. The Attorney General explains that they issued this report rather than file a lawsuit against the police department because most complainants were unwilling to testify against police in court, and that changes in law enforcement practices were unlikely to come from litigation. Instead, the Attorney General makes a series of recommendations which the police department adopts selectively. Meanwhile, Carol's family establishes a scholarship in her name for inner city residents who were mistakenly targeted during the investigation.
This is so sad. I said so much tragedy came out of this crime for so many people, and I can't imagine what Carol's family must feel or how they were able to put everything behind and do something positive, That takes a lot of courage.
100%. So Saadia, given all you know and what we told you, what do you think? Was this a hate crime?
I don't think, Asad, because to me, this was just a premeditated cold-blooded murder of a spouse. I don't see the hate crime element in it, but I am curious to know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the fact that he specifically says that a black man did it, I think that's where the hate crime aspect, comes
interesting.
in, right? Like he specifically is targeting a community, right, for a fake crime. And so the crime of him murdering his wife is not a hate crime, but the crime of him implicating a quote unquote black man, to me, that is a clear hate crime towards Swanson and Bennett. And then I think also we've discussed this before, how there could be something in the realm of a hate crime in terms of how the police also targeted Bennett.
You're right. And it does make sense now because he created this plot where he murdered her publicly so that he could pin it on someone else, and that someone else being an African American person.
Totally.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I am curious to know what others think about this. Asad, I wonder if this could be staged or this crime could happen today.
So, we talked a couple of weeks ago about the case of Jesse Smollett, right? Like of him staging or potentially staging, a crime as well. Like something like this happening today, I bet it happens all the time and we just don't know about it, right? I think whether it's murder or if it's just smaller crimes, like I think these type of things happen probably a lot more than we are aware of and blamed on people of color or minorities far more than we're aware, for sure.
Yeah, but with social media, I think things have changed a lot.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, for sure.
Information has been democratized in some ways. So, Asad, what happened to some of the other players in this investigation?
Yeah, so Swanson remained destitute, homeless, and traumatized. Bennett tried unsuccessfully to sue the Boston police for violating his civil rights by coercing potential witnesses against him. In 1995, he sued the city instead and settled for, get this, $12,500.
Only $12,500.
He did later go to prison for an armed robbery that he claims he did not commit. He served 12 years and was released in 2002. Bennett now has dementia and lives a private life and is still angry that he is forever tied to Charles Stuart and was never fairly compensated. Sadly, he says that he knows that things would have ended up differently if the brother never came forward.
Exactly.
And he says that he'll see Charles Stuart in hell. Matthew, meanwhile, the brother, died of an overdose in a homeless shelter in Cambridge in 2011. And then, Saadia, I think something, just recently that happened in December of this past year, the new Boston Mayor Michelle Wu, issued a formal apology to both Alan Swanson and to Willie Bennett. Take a listen.
We are here today to acknowledge the tremendous pain that the city of Boston inflicted on Black residents throughout our neighborhoods 34 years ago. The mayor's office, city officials, and the Boston Police Department took actions that directly harmed these families and continue to impact the larger community, reopening a wound that has gone untended for decades. In response to the murder of Carol Stewart and her child, and acting on a false, racist claim, framing a Black man for her death, the city launched a systemic campaign targeting Black men in Mission Hill and across our neighborhoods.
Similarly, the Boston Police Commissioner Michael Cox, who is Black, also spoke at that press conference and said that as a commissioner, he apologizes for the hurt, pain, and suffering experienced by everyone affected by the Boston Police Department, for their poor investigation, for their overzealous behavior, and more than likely unconstitutional behavior.
Wow, long overdue, Asad.
Over the years, Saadia, this case has received national attention as it's been covered in TV, movies, songs, and poems. Most recently, there was an HBO special, which I just saw a couple weeks ago, called Murder in Boston, Roots, Rampage, and Reckoning, and its associated podcast was presented by the Boston Globe. I highly recommend it. It goes into a lot more detail. It's, I think, a 3-part series, just really interesting and dives really deeper into the race relations of that time and even previously in the Boston area. So definitely we'll have links to that in the show notes.
Absolutely, I said an important case for people to listen to and look at when they have time, right? Because these things are still happening. As you said, we may not be aware, but these things happen every time, and it's important to be informed.
Totally. Thanks so much for listening to Invisible Hate. If you want to learn more, please check on the links in the show notes and email us your thoughts on this story or any other story. You can reach us at info@invisiblehatepodcast.com. You can also find us on all the socials, including Instagram and Twitter. Just search for Invisible Hate Podcast.
Thanks again for listening. If you like what you hear, please share with a friend. Invisible Hate is a joint production of Refilion Media and Immigrantly. We would like to thank our team, which includes Michaela Strother, Emmanuel Monahan, Lindsay Gambu, and Paroma Chakravarti. Our music was done by Simon Hutchinson. We'll be back next week with another hate crime for us to analyze. Until next time, I'm Saadia Khan.
And I'm Asad Butt. Take care.